Mr. Takanaka has telling me that he was forced to do it because the United States threatened to hit Japan with HAARP, H-A-A-R-P, if they didn't. Okay?
Okay, and what would have been the impact of that? I mean, tell us what that meant to Japan.
Earthquakes. So I asked him, is it true? And I have this on tape too. He says, yes, we have to, in order to protect the environment, we need to reduce the world population to 2 billion. And war just doesn't do it, so we're going to try to use disease and starvation. I use Rockefeller as a abbreviation for this group of inbred aristocratic families, the American side versus the European side.
Right.
But, I mean, the Bushes are part of it, for example. They had 2 rings. One was a mask of a devil with horns, and the other looked like a wedding ring. And you go like this, and there is a Freemason mark. And he says these horns, you could put a little bit of poison on them, touch me, and I'd be dead. And he tells me he's a ninja, which is a professional assassin. He says to me, Mr. Fulford, if you want to be, a muckraking journalist, go ahead and do so, but you will die at age 46. However, and he gives me a big Freemason badge. He says, if you don't, the other choice is you can become finance minister of Japan. Okay? So he's offering me a choice between death and the job of finance minister. That's how he described it. So, we're looting these people's money, but we're not going to kill them, And he said the population in Japan would be reduced to 70 million. But they would allow 70 million to live. And they need about 500 million Asians to keep making toys and stuff. So he's describing, massive genocide. I guess a lot of people at the very elite, I'm sure it happens to Mr. Obama and Clinton and anybody else at the high level of U.S. politics, that they're someday, or senators, whatever, they're given the same kind of ultimatum. Death or cooperation. So either you join us or you die. And that's how they managed to control the United States and enslave the American people. And I had this great, what I call my Kill Bill moment. There's a scene in the movie Kill Bill, these 2 women fighting with swords. It looks like it's going to be a long, nasty fight.
Right.
It's not going to be sure who's the winner, right?
Yes.
But one of the women, the bad one, has a one eye missing. She has a patch. Mm-hmm. And suddenly, she grabs the eye and blinds her and ends the fight.
Unbelievable, yeah. Very, very graphic.
Very graphic, but I thought, hey, why not just target the eye of the pyramid? Because most Westerners don't even know it exists. I realize the society has 6 million members, and the Western secret society at the top is only 10,000. So it's 6 million against 10,000. So suddenly I said, well, that's it. Isn't it? We got these bastards. I became the first Westerner in 500 years to join.
A bodyguard at that point? Did you hire someone?
No. Look,
no?
If you need a bodyguard, it's too late.
Oh.
You have to operate at a higher level. I mean, if they really want to shoot me, they're going to shoot me. You have to make them not want to shoot you. The key to democracy is control over money by the people, not by a secret elite. It's the money that counts. If you lose control over your money, hand it over to people you can't see, you're a slave. That's what you have to remember. Never, ever again let some secret power elite take control of your money away from you. If they're going to try to kill billions of people, then we're going to have to kill 10,000 people in order to prevent that, if necessary. And the arrangements have been made.
I'm Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot, and we're really pleased to be here with Ben Fulford today, former Bureau Chief, Asia Pacific for Forbes magazine, which is really fabulous. You did that for 6 years, I understand.
Yeah, about 6.
6. And you've been living and working as a writer and journalist in Japan for 20 years?
More than that. I first came in 1980.
Oh, really?
I was a student. I went to university here.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, so you went to the University of Tokyo, or what's it called?
Well, maybe I should give you my a brief background. I was born in Ottawa, Canada, in 1961. And when I was 6 months old, my family moved to Cuba. My father was a Canadian diplomat.
Right, okay.
He was kicked out by Castro because he was helping all these refugees escape. Then I lived in Mexico until I was 8. And then from 8 to about 16, I lived in Canada. Went to a French school. So I grew up speaking 3 languages.
So you actually spoke Spanish?
And English as a child, and then French, you know. From middle school on, it was all in French, so.
All right.
And then, you know, I was at the tail end of the hippie era, and I was picking up like these echoes from the past that was going on, and this is the street wisdom as opposed to what you're learning in school. And you know, the word was that if you went to university, they would just brainwash you into being a consumer, and that you know there was something wrong with the world that the grown-ups had made. It was sort of the zeitgeist at the time, right? And I decided that if I went to university, I would also be brainwashed. So I decided to escape. I went to the Amazon. I lived with some people, Indians.
How old were you at that time when you...
17.
Really? I mean, that's incredibly gutsy to do something like that. The Amazon is very...
Well, I mean, actually they were former cannibals.
Yeah,
but,
so... even...
Yeah, I mean, a lot of, you know, hair-raising experiences, you know, machine guns held in my head and all sorts of stuff like that. Nearly eaten by a bear, chased by wolves.
So you went to the Amazon, you're like 17 years old, and you're not going to college. Did your parents have a problem with that?
Well, I mean, what could they do? I mean, I physically left and disappeared. I mean, why, you know.
So you're just very independent from a young age?
Yeah, I think I was sort of, I mean, I'd go, you know, spending nights out in the wilderness alone, like from age around 12 and stuff. So
Wow.
It was, for me, it was just really itching to go.
Is it, I mean, did your Fulford name, because, you know, we know about, like, your grandfather was, you know, this very well-known Fulford. Was your family considered, you know, I don't know, part of the ruling class in Canada at that point,
well,
or
sure.
not?
I mean, my great-grandfather was, you know, what would be today a billionaire and a senator. And my grandfather was an MP, member of Parliament for about 20 years. And my father was an ambassador to, you know, different countries.
So you would be considered something of a child of the elite at that point?
Sure. At the same time, I had a very unusual upbringing, and we were taught from a very young age, you know, to have a lot of empathy. And I was very disturbed by things I saw as a child in Mexico, in extreme poverty. I'll never forget when I was 7. I met this kid on the streets, and we played and talked. And he was the same height as me and about the same mental, you know, level. And it turns out he was 12. I asked my mother, how could that be? And she said, well, he doesn't have enough food to eat. I said, how could such a thing be allowed to happen? You know, and it's happening right now to billions of people. Right. They're not allowed to develop their human potential. They're not getting adequate education, adequate nutrition, medical care, nothing. I mean, it's a shame that such things are allowed to happen. At the same time, when I was in the Amazon, you know, it was a beautiful virgin forest, but they told me that in about 5 years it would be gone because the loggers were coming. And I said, what's out there that's destroying the nature and leaving so many people suffering? How could this be? And to me, it was clear that, and this is what you got us, you know, in this third world, in the street, at the poor level. There's something wrong with the way the Westerners were ruling the planet. And so I decided finally, after lots of, about 3.5 years of traveling, adventures, and you know, to compensate for not going to university, I read all the holy books, the Quran, the Bible, Confucius, Lao Tzu, you know, the Bhagavad Gita, etc., etc.
Great. So you studied. Were you studying Eastern philosophy, say, before you came to Japan?
You know, mystic stuff. You know, like meditating and.
I mean, like the I Ching. Have you read that?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
All that kind of stuff.
Great.
And you know, the word on the street level was that something would have to come from the East to help us, right? So I finally decided I'd go to university in Japan. It was a choice between India, China, and Japan. For various reasons, I chose Japan.
Did you know at that point you were going into economics? I mean, I'm assuming that was maybe your major.
I just wanted to learn. I didn't think about majors or jobs. In fact, I took every subject there is, I think. Right from economics, sociology, anthropology, math, biology, you name it. I took up to at least third-year level courses in all the courses, in all the subjects.
Did you graduate with a degree?
I eventually got a degree from the University of British Columbia in Asian Studies with a China area specialty.
So you went to British Columbia.
I went to Sophia University in Japan for 3.5 years.
Okay.
I took, like I say, about 8 years worth of undergraduate courses, way more than I needed. I mean,
how did you learn Japanese?
Well, 2 ways. I arrived in Japan. I took a 2-month intensive course at the University of British Columbia before coming, and then. Okay. I arrived in Japan. I spent 3 days at a Japanese school, and I said, this is useless. I got a job as a bartender in a bar run by a gangster. And it was from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. And it was some sort of place where it had fights, and sometimes people would come in naked, and very, kind of lowest level of Japan you could find, basically. But the good thing about bartender as a job for learning the language is that drunks keep saying the same thing over and over again. So you eventually pick it up. Also, I went to what's called Futon University. I had a girlfriend who didn't speak English.
Oh, okay.
It was a combination, but I used to sort of speak like a cross between a gangster and transvestite. It's kind of either very womanly or very like low-level street talk.
At this point, that's how you're describing your ability to speak the Japanese language. That's hilarious.
I was more or less able to carry on a fluent conversation after about 6 months.
Wow. That's great. So do you write Japanese at all? Can you read it?
Yeah, I've written, I think, over a dozen books in Japanese.
Oh, right.
Many of them bestsellers.
And I have to know, are your books available in English? Because we didn't see that.
No, I mean, I haven't actually. I deliberately switched to Japanese a few years ago after I left Forbes because I knew that I was dealing with something dangerous, and I didn't quite understand what it was.
Oh, wow.
I remember being warned, for example, by Makiko Tanaka, the former foreign minister and the daughter of Prime Minister Kakoi Tanaka, who was taken down in the Lockheed scandal. And she told me, she said, hey, if you start looking into this stuff, you're going to get killed. So I knew that there was something very dangerous. I didn't know exactly what it was, so I kind of went underground and started writing in Japanese.
At that point, Ben, could I just ask you, that stuff you referred to, at that point, what was the stuff that you were starting to get into, which you were warned about? At that point, what was the stuff?
When I was at Forbes, I had already written several stories about the Yakuza and the gangsters, and I got lots of death threats as a result. And now the Moscow bureau chief for Forbes, Paul Klebnikov, was shot 10 times, outside of his house, and taken to the hospital and put in the elevator, and the elevator stopped for 8 minutes, and that's where he died.
Wow. And what year was this? Do you know, approximately?
5 or 6 years ago, I think.
Okay. So you, at the time, were you working for Forbes, or had you just left?
I was working for Forbes. He was the Moscow guy, I was the Tokyo guy. So
okay.
I knew him.
Okay.
And around that time, some people from the Asahi newspaper and the TBS television came to me and said that the head of the Goto crime syndicate was in UCLA Berkeley University Hospital getting a liver transplant. Now this raised a lot of interesting questions. One is, what is a known gangster and criminal doing getting a visa to the US? And why is a 70-year-old guy like that getting bumped to the top of the long waiting list for liver transplants? So I started thinking, well, maybe he was doing some work for the CIA or something. And I was going to write this up in Forbes. And before that, I called up a very senior gangster source I knew, and told him about this. And he said, hey, if you write that, you're going to get turned into fish paste. I said, what? I don't respond to threats, I said. So we never threaten. I said, but, well, I'm a well-known journalist. If you kill me, I'm going to cause a lot of trouble. So, well, we won't kill you. You'll just disappear. You'll say goodnight to your girlfriend, and that's it. You'll never be seen again. And then he named a couple of journalists who disappeared.
Oh, man.
Now, I remember them. There was a guy, for example, who wrote about how the Goto gang was selling, how the Om Shinrikyo religious sect was importing amphetamines from North Korea and selling them to the Goto gang. And he disappeared after writing a few articles like that. And some of the other...
Has he ever been found?
No. A whole bunch of them disappeared.
Okay.
And a lot of the Japanese journalists told me, the only reason you're still alive is because you're a white guy. If we tried to write that same kind of stuff, we'd be dead. So I knew there were some dangerous people. And by the way, after when this gangster guy, when I told him about the liver transplant thing, finally he said, look, I won't be able to talk to you again if you write that story. And I thought, okay, this guy is a very senior source, and he's giving me a lot of valuable information, and I don't want to lose this connection over one story. So I decided not to write the story, but it was a very kind of bad atmosphere. And then I flew off to Sakhalin.
What's that? I'm sorry.
In Russia.
Oh.
The Russian Far East, where they have all the oil and gas now.
Right.
To do a story. And the local representative of his gang was waiting for me. He took me around, and I was taken to a giant casino with about 400 Chechens standing outside. Mm-hmm. It was like something in a movie. They all had guns, and they were hired by the Japanese gang as bodyguards for their casino. Oh. And
Chechens,
yeah, working for the Japanese gangsters. There's a lot of stuff going on that you just don't see in the surface.
Right. Well, we just got back from Moscow, actually. So it's a fascinating place.
Well, so in Asia, you'll find that there's no real line between gangsters and government. It's all a continuum. So you can almost think of these
some would
gangsters...
say that's true of, the U.S. and Russia and, yeah.
Sure. In the U.S., large parts of the CIA are basically organized crime, what they're doing, I mean, large parts are honest, patriotic people trying to defend their country, but there are groups in there that, as we all know, they smuggle drugs and do all sorts of criminal stuff.
Right.
So I'm sitting in this club, and this guy's beside me. He's really not like the one I knew in Tokyo. He's like a very high-level businessman. This guy was a real thug, really dangerous, and not a nice guy. And he's very, very tense. I said, listen, I want to go home. He says, no, you can't. You're going to be killed or something, right? And I just realized suddenly I was being set up for a hit.
Oh, my.
So I quickly, oh, my God. I point to these two oil men. I said, you don't have to worry about me. See, those guys are CIA, and they're guarding me. Plus, I have a file that will go public if anything happens to me. That names names and puts you all in jail. It was total bluff, okay? I didn't have any such file, and those guys were just oil men, but what can I do? And the guy just gets up, like a rocket, with the phone, running out the door, and I pick up my phone, I call Tokyo, I say, listen, I'm not here to write about your dealings with Russian gangsters and stuff. I'm here to write about the oil industry. I'm not going to cause you any trouble. So the guy comes back, he's all relaxed. And I said, okay, good night. And that's it. But...
That's something out of a movie.
Yeah, but they really did shoot, the Chechens really did shoot my colleague, didn't they? That was after this happened to me, but... So, once that took place, I did make a file, and I still have it, in hard disks and DVDs with voice recordings and videos. For example, a well-known Japanese prime minister has murdered 3 women, and I have the proof in one of these. A lot of stuff like that, but... My job is not to try to expose people, okay? That's not where I'm coming from. That was just insurance I had to take out. I don't need that insurance anymore because I have this secret society backing me. But again, my idea was, I'm not just trying to expose people. That's not the level I'm at anymore. I'm trying to save the planet.
Right.
So this stuff will never come out, probably, ever, as long as they don't kill me. Basically, if they do, there'll be horrible repercussions of all sorts. But again, I'm trying to make a win-win situation for everybody. Okay, so now we go back. When I just arrived in Japan, you want to talk about that? Is that right?
Well, yeah, but I kind of wanted to get a nugget of what it was in your Amazon experience that you kind of discovered. Like, what did going there
for
crystallize
example,
for you?
You see, what I did was, my thinking was, a fish does not know water exists until it jumps. So to understand civilization, I had to leave it. So I tried different things. In the Amazon, they survived on fish and bananas. So you have roast bananas and fish soup, or banana soup and roast fish, or roast fish and roast bananas. You get the idea, right?
Right.
I got tired of it, and I said, well, why don't we get some meat? I said, okay, we'll go hunting. Spend all day in the jungle. Don't catch anything. Come back, we're hungry. There's nothing to eat. So we lose in civilization that contact between our working and our eating and our surviving. So we kind of so many layers in between actually getting food from the earth and putting it in our mouths that we don't realize sometimes. So that's the thing I learned there.
Okay.
The other thing is that these people are much simpler in their communications. They're very straightforward. They say exactly what you think. So you walk in the room and the first thing they think is, hey, you're fat. They'll say it. Whereas in civilization, it's much more complex. They say, oh, you're looking healthy or something. Or, they try not to, Anyway.
The mask is not so deep.
Yeah. And the other thing is these people were former cannibals. So the elders all used to eat human meat when they were young. And they explained to me that in the rainy season, they couldn't get enough fish, so the only way to get protein was to eat their neighbors. Now they survive with canned fish in the rainy season. But
okay, but did you go there by yourself? I just have to know.
Yeah.
Completely alone?
Yeah, I hitchhiked and got in a boat and just kind of arrived at the village.
Unbelievable. Okay. Well, you must have an incredibly strong personality.
I had read, the teachings of Don Juan.
Yeah.
Right? And I was looking for a witch doctor.
Okay.
To do an apprenticeship.
I see.
I actually found a witch doctor and did do an apprenticeship in Amazon. So that's
why I went. So you had some training in magic.
Yeah, I can purge river spirits and stuff from you if you need it.
Okay.
And,
Good
I know
to
some
hear.
of the herbs and plants, and
right.
I did a lot of this stuff called ayahuasca, which.
That's like a trippy drug, right?
Yeah, at the time there was almost nothing written about it in English, right? Mm-hmm. And like I said, I had to go right up to the upper reaches of the Ucayali River and out to find the people Indians to find the stuff. So you can imagine my surprise when I see it for sale on the street here as a legal drug years later, which it shouldn't be.
You mean here in Tokyo?
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting.
Well, there's no specific law against it. But anyway,
so fast forward, you're here, you're in Tokyo, you've gone to college, and did you go to apply to work for Forbes at that point? I don't.
No, my first job I wanted to write a theory of everything, but you can't really pay the bills that way. So the first job I got was with an outfit called Knight Ridder, which was part of the Knight Ridder newspaper chain. So it was but it was their financial wire. So I would go and meet finance ministers and governors of Bank of Japan and stuff, and all the market news. So my stories would move the dollar, move the yen, or move the price of commodities every week, just back and forth. And it's really amazing to see that what I learned there as a financial market reporter is that it's really, finance is mass psychology. It's mob psychology. And that was a very interesting lesson that you don't learn in the school club, you know.
So you learned like the power of the written word at that point, right?
Well, it's the information and how they all have this story that they're following, and they're looking for slight changes. For example, if the governor of the Bank of Japan says, well, we might tighten interest rates a bit, and everything moves, right? Or even for the commodity markets, rumors that China is going to buy oil or something like that cause everything to move.
But tell me something about your background, because we listened to this interview with the Canadian radio, and you show an incredible understanding about the economy of the world, really, and what makes it tick. And I'm just wondering, where did you learn everything that you learned in that way?
Well, of course, I did all the the university classes in
Right.
economics and stuff. But basically, for over 20 years, I've been following it, writing about it. I mean, everybody comes through Tokyo. Presidents, prime ministers, finance ministers, they have their G7s and all that stuff.
G7 is here right now, as you may know.
So I've been following it for over 20 years at the highest level. And
Okay.
I've been interviewing gangsters, prime ministers, finance ministers, presidents of big companies, presidents of small companies, just more than 20 years, almost 30 years interviewing all sorts of
So
people.
it's an education in itself, I guess, interviewing,
Yeah.
as we find.
As a journalist, you find that your job is a filter. You suck in huge amounts of information and look for the nuggets that are easy to understand and convey the essence, and you give that to the public. So that's the job, You're an information filter.
But there are a lot of other financial journalists out there who are towing the party line.
Well,
And this is categorically what you haven't been doing. You're a real maverick in this field.
Well, you see, it's very high-level propaganda. They're brainwashed. They really, really do not understand at the essence of what it's all about. And that's the trick. They try to get people sidetracked into esoteric mathematics, and they try to cover it with lots of complex words. So, they've come up with these derivatives that are so complex that most people don't even understand what they mean anymore. Like, I remember even almost 15 years ago or more talking about delta hedge formations, and so they get into this stuff, and it blinds them. It's like almost a deliberate, confusion, because at the essence, it's really very simple. Economics is people working to earn their living. And finance is a process of deciding what people will do next. And they try to not let us understand this, especially the part about finance. And that is the key to the world's problems now.
So how did you, as a journalist for Forbes, was it gradual the way that you, because I can imagine if you have this knowledge that you have and you have this approach, as a journalist, didn't you get pushback from Forbes saying, no, don't write this, or don't
okay,
phrase
maybe I
it
should
that
give
way?
you, I'll show you how I discovered things in chronological order, maybe the easiest way. First thing I noticed in Japan that everything was not as it seemed was when I saw some people lined up at a little booth. And I said, what are you doing? I said, well, we're exchanging our prizes for money from the pachinko, which is a kind of slot machine. And you find out that they have a huge gambling industry with giant neon signs everywhere that's basically illegal. And yet it functions openly and with rules. For example, no matter how hard you could try, it's going to be hard to lose more than $1,000 a day at those places. So here we have a whole system outside of the legal framework. And it connects policemen, gangsters, and businessmen all outside of the so-called legal apparatus. So this is something that made me realize something was different about this country. It was not just a Asian version of Canada, which on the surface it is. They have the upper house and lower house, they have the courts and everything. So structurally it's the same, but in essence it's totally different. What I learned was that this so-called legal democratic system was a front for a very different a real power structure.
Okay.
This is something that I learned in tidbits. But the first was a pachinko. Another one was a friend of mine got beaten up by a gangster in front of a police box. He went to the police box, and the police box guy said, the policeman said, you shouldn't pick fights with gangsters. That's it. So again, I said, geez, that's weird. But again, I thought this was just related to gambling and prostitution, which is kind of a gray area anywhere really. So, I didn't think much about it until, as a financial journalist with the wire service, it's very important to be quick. If you beat your competitors by 30 seconds, it's considered a big scoop.
Right.
So you have to find out where the power comes from. And talking, for example, to the bureaucrats at the Agriculture Ministry, they said, well, if you want to know what's really happening, you talk to Mr. Koichi Kato. He was a LDP power broker. And he was the man making decisions then. And so I got to know him. And I got called as a pinch hitter for one of his speeches. And then he came up and made his speech, and it was very impressive. And then he got a big fat envelope of cash. I said, oh, politics, certain. And then I thought the finance ministry was the real source of power in Japan. That's what people believed. It was the most powerful bureaucracy. But when I started talking to finance minister people, at the finance ministry, they told me finally, if you really want to know what's going on, you have to go to Nomura Securities. And this was in the 80s. It's different now. But in the 80s, during the bubble, Nomura Securities had a VIP list of 5,000 people. And they had these two bosses, the big Tabuchi and the little Tabuchi, not related, who were later proved to be connected to a big crime gang. But they would take all these journalists, politicians, the sort of top movers and shakers, and they'd lend them a couple $1 million. And they say, buy this stock. And then they would take every salesman in the country and all their journalistic connections and say, these are the stocks you got to buy now. And every housewife and small businessman and doctor would buy these stocks, the price would go up, and the VIPs would sell. So that was how they controlled politics. So
Now, you say it's different now, so how's it different?
Well, it's different players, different ways of handing out the money. And in fact, that is the core of the problem which we're dealing with. But we'll do this step by step because it's easier to see the whole story then. So I got quite cynical about Japan. But the real clincher for me was the Jusen housing loan scandal. This was a bunch of companies that lent only for real estate. And after the Japanese bubble burst, it was the first time they're going to use taxpayer money. By the way, in 1992, the Japanese government already knew they had 200 trillion yen in bad debt. But the newspapers only said 2 or 3 trillion. And it wasn't until more than 10 years later they finally admitted the whole number. And that's what's happening in the U.S. right now, only they're not going to have 10 years because they didn't borrow it from other Americans. They borrowed it from the rest of the world. So you'll see huge changes there, but we'll get to that.
Okay.
Anyway.
This is a question I'd like to bookmark because I remember that you said to Rents that you felt that, in your opinion, the U.S. debt was 120 trillion. And I went and looked it up and thought, I wonder where that figure comes from. So I'd like to ask you that.
Well, I can tell you right now, the 66 trillion comes from the essay by Professor Kilbourne that was published by the St. Louis Federal Reserve Board branch in 2005. And that's the money they owe to American citizens. Stuff they promised to pay, like Medicaid and Social Security and things like that. It's in that essay, you can find it. Now, the other 53 trillion is the amount of dollars out in circulation outside the U.S. It's the amount of...
I gotcha.
So add them together and you get 120 trillion.
But 120 is a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, you've only got a GDP of 13 trillion. Well, this is where the whole scam unravels. But we'll get to that. But
okay.
it's
Okay, so this housing, you've got the housing.
All right, so here's the point, is that they were going, I was working for the Nihon Keizai Shimbun at this point. It's like the Japanese Wall Street Journal. It's in Japanese, but it's their #1 business finance newspaper by far. And they were talking about pouring in tens of billions of dollars in taxpayer money to bail out these companies. And there were some weird discussions about borrower responsibility. Borrower responsibility, what's going on here? And so I started saying, well, who are these borrowers? And it turns out, this is my sources were people at the Bank of Japan and various other agencies, like credit rating agencies, that more than half the loans were made to gangsters, to Yakuza gangs. So it was to me, it was an amazing thing. Here we have the government using tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer money to bail out companies that lent money to gangsters. And they were all headed by former finance ministry officials. So you see a link now between the finance ministry officials, politicians, and gangsters. And they're using taxpayer money to give to the gangsters, right? So I wrote this up in the English Nikkei, and there was a huge reaction. Over 400 foreign journalists or magazines wrote similar stories. Half the the housing loans went to gangsters, right? And then Newsweek wrote a story almost identical to mine. And then the Nikkei, their own paper, said, according to Newsweek, half the loans to the to the Jusen companies are to Yakuza. And I went to the editor. I said, hey, I wrote that story first. Why do you say according to Newsweek? And they called me up and they gave me the editor's award and $50. And then they told me, Mr. Fulford, you know, you really shouldn't write stuff like that. It's just not done and it could be dangerous. And after that, they started watching me. And they would not let me write anything except the stuff the government announced.
Wow.
So,
and this is after you left Forbes. You're writing
before I got to Forbes.
Oh, before you got to Forbes. Okay.
Right? So I started to realize the Japanese press was not at all free.
I see.
And, you know, it turns out there was an editor at the Nikkei, Mr. Otsuka, who won a bunch of awards for writing about the Ito Man scandal, and then he was suddenly sent off to some weird subdivision, removed from the reporting business, and he got very suspicious. He started following the president around. It turns out they lent like $100 million to gangsters, money that would never come back. And the Ito Man scandal was another huge one, which basically one of Japan's largest banks, Sumitomo Bank, had been taken over by a crime syndicate. This is what the story really boiled down to. It's a long, complicated thing, but anyway, I started to realize that the newspapers and the politicians and the bureaucrats and the gangsters were all in together in some kind of crooked power structure that was totally different from what people were seeing on their television or reading in their newspapers. Mm-hmm. And I got totally disgusted when they started suppressing my stories. So I quit the Nikkei. I worked as a freelancer for a while, South China Morning Post, a bunch of places, before I got the job with Forbes.
Okay.
And at first, the people at Forbes were happy to let me write stories about gangsters. I did one on public works that got a formal letter of protest from the Japanese embassy in Washington, which is, I thought, you know, good. I hit a sore point, right? And then there was another story I did when they were finally starting to clear up the bad debt with the banks. I was finding all sorts of people were dying. And this is either committing suicide or, you know, disappearing, whatever. But it was not a typical what you call harakiri suicides where you did something bad and you kill yourself to apologize. It was people who were going to testify, people who were going to prosecute people. For example, there was a financial scandal and the president of Daiichi Kangyo Bank, which is now part of Mizuho, was due to testify. The day before he was going to testify, at 11 o'clock at night, his wife left the house. And about 10 men in black clothing showed up. The lights turned off. Then they left. At around 1 a.m., The wife came home and he was dead. And they said it was a suicide. Now this came from the English version of the Yomiuri newspaper. It did not appear in the Japanese version. Okay? Now, so I then, at this point, I made lots of gangster connections because I realized that to understand what's going on in finance, you need to talk to gangsters. Otherwise, you don't know what's going on at all.
Okay.
And so there was a bank called the Nippon Credit Bank that turned into Aozora Bank. I think it's now owned by one of those U.S. hedge funds, maybe Carlyle, I can't remember, I have to check. But anyway, the director from the Bank of Japan, Mr. Honma, was made president. And 2 weeks later, he was found hung. They said it was a suicide. And I knew this guy from when I used to cover the Bank of Japan. I said, no way he could have committed suicide. So I asked my gangster buddy, and he said, well, I'll check out with the guys down in Osaka. And he calls him, and I meet him again. He says, well, what happened was they pointed a gun at him, told him to write his will, and they injected him with a sleeping drug, and they hung him. And of course, I cannot write a story based on an anonymous gangster. And I knew he was a gangster because I had a detective agency confirm for me that he really was what he said he was. He was a senior boss of one of the biggest gangs. So I called the hotel, and where they found his body, and said, yeah, well, you know the place they found the body? Well, there's nowhere to hang himself from, right? So I called the police and said, well, you said you found the body by the window, but there's nowhere to hang himself by the window. So the police changed it, say, oh, well, we found him in the bathroom. And there was a Japanese TV personality in the room next door, Mori Kumiko, or Kumiko Mori. In Japan, she does the voice of Pikachu, you know, from the, what is it, Pocket Monsters?
Oh,
anyway.
yeah, Pokemon?
Anyway, she's well known in Japan.
Okay.
And she wrote in her blog that there was screaming and moaning in the room next door, and she couldn't sleep, and there was no way that could have been a suicide. And I confirmed that with her manager. And apparently, he was killed because a bunch of loans to North Korean credit cooperatives. He was going to call them as bad loans. And if he did that, he would have exposed a huge North Korean ruling party underground link. The North Koreans have been sending pachinko money to Japan, importing amphetamines, doing all sorts of stuff. And to get the police to turn a blind eye, they paid huge bribes to the ruling party over the years.
Did you write about this?
I wrote it in Forbes, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's there. Although, you know, the editors are such chickens that they really took a lot of that out of that story, but it's still there. You can still find it. So I started digging deeper. But then, suddenly, Forbes starts putting pressure on me. I had a story about GE doing some very funky accounting here, involving billions of dollars, you know. They killed it without explanation. And then Citigroup was kicked out of Japan for, you know, money laundering for gangsters. They were kicked out, and that story didn't run, right? And finally, what for me was the last straw was a antivirus software company paid a guy to make a virus, a computer virus, right? And I talked to the guy who made the virus, you know, and he's some guy living in a Filipino slum, but he's got a brand new $20,000 car, you know. And anyway, they said to me, well, this guy is the president of the company, is a friend of Mr. Forbes, and he bought a lot of advertising, and so we're not running his story.
Oh. So they told you that, they actually told you the real reason?
Well, the editor told me that, you know, we have problems with your facts, Mr. Fulford, you know, fact checking. This is their trick. They raise the hurdle higher and higher. Facts. For example, you saw them in bed together. Are you sure? That doesn't mean they're making love. Was there a blanket on top? No, there's no blanket. Well, did you see the actual penetration? Well, no, his butt was in the way. Oh, well, then we don't know. You can't confirm it. Sorry. That's their trick. That's how they train the corporate media. They raise the facts. But anyway, the business manager told me the real reason.
Okay.
That the advertising and stuff. So, you know, I get one thing from the editor, another thing from the business manager. So I got totally disgusted and alienated, right? And so after that, the quality of my work at Forbes degenerated because I just didn't give a damn, and I was going to quit. I was getting ready to quit. At that point, a book of mine appeared in Japanese, became a bestseller. So I didn't need the income.
A book about what?
Well, just the first.
This isn't the Rockefeller one, is it?
No. This is stuff that came out a long time ago. Some of the stuff I just told you about the murders and the other stuff going on. It was about Japanese corruption, and a lot of people in Japan were, knew something like this was going on. And so anyway, I wrote several bestsellers like that.
Okay.
So I had an independent income, but what really made things click for me was I was on a TV debate show with some of Japan's top politicians. And I said, these are the guys running this country? Come on, you gotta give me a break. They're retards. I'm sorry to say this, but they're not high caliber. Okay, I'm debating them. So what on earth is going on? Now I know, of course, they're just actors reading a script, but at the time I thought, my God, I could do better. And then suddenly it was like, it was too enormous, the thought, but I realized, oh my God, the Japanese have $5 trillion in overseas assets. That's enough money to end poverty and stop environmental destruction. Well, why don't they use it? And I decided, hell, I could become a cynical alcoholic, foreign correspondent old fart like I see so many of at the Foreign Correspondents Club, who just, their careers plateau out and they just spend years coasting along and getting bitter and cynical.
Right.
And I said, no, hell with that. I'll become a Japanese citizen. I'll try to run for office and I'll try to convince them to use this money to save the world. That makes so much sense. But at the same time, though, I was very confused and bitter, right? And I wasn't, so another part of me was saying, well, you should write a book about Japan and then leave the country and go to Hollywood, try to become a scriptwriter or something. So it's two conflicting ideas in my mind. I had that one idea, but it's just too big, and two is no, it just can't be real, right? But so I wrote 2 chapters that would have really named names, specific politicians, specific crimes, specific gangsters. And it would have been so much of an expose that I would have had to either leave Japan or be killed after the book was published. Mm-hmm. The very day after I sent 2 chapters to my agent in English, I got a call from the granddaughter of the Meiji Emperor, Kaoru Nakamaru. And she said to me, Mr. Fulford, you really should not get the Yakuza angry. And are you sure that's what you really want to do? Isn't there something else you'd rather do? And I said, why is this lady calling me at this timing? And she tells me that a goddess had contacted her through the astral plane and was worried about me. Well, it turns out the goddess was the Japanese security police. But, whatever. She still insists it's a goddess. Only one time did she tell me it was the police. Every other time she says it's a goddess. But anyway, it doesn't matter. It was the timing, and what you really want to do is not something else. And I realized, yes, I want to save the world. And unlike so many people want to do that, I actually had a concrete method. So it was $5 trillion. Well, that's enough money. And you can't take that money out of the U.S. because that would ruin the U.S. economy. So you have to pay Americans to do it, right? So that they benefit as well. Otherwise, in the past, what happened was if a Japanese politician threatens to take that money out of the U.S., well, then the U.S. is going to get really angry and try to crush that politician, right? So I think, okay, well, we'll do it in such a way that the Americans benefit too. Then they can't complain. And this is what I started setting out. So I started writing books along those lines. Why don't the Japanese save the world?
Okay.
But what happened though, you see, with this Meiji Emperor's granddaughter handed me a 911 video and said, look, Mr. Fulford, you know all about the corruption in Japan, but you have no idea about the corruption in the world, right?
Okay.
And when she gave me that, I was shocked. I said, oh my God, I read about this in the New York Times. This is some anti-Semitic thing. I'm not going to look at that, because we've all been trained anti-Semitic equals Nazi, which equals gas chambers, right? And you don't want to be involved with people who want to kill millions of innocent people, right? So this is the sort of thinking I had. So I wasn't even going to look at it because I had it all associated. And she kept calling me, did you watch it? No, did you watch it? And finally I said, oh man, I'll watch 10 minutes so I can tell her that I watched it. And when I did, it was like the scales fell off my eyes, as they say in Japanese. It's like, remember, I was a financial journalist for a long time. And because so many people read what you write, it moves markets. So you have a constant barrage of people trying to feed you BS information, which means you build very high immunity to false information.
Okay.
So I knew, I mean, this is something very, very weird. Because, and the problem most people at the high level of Western society have with the 911 thing is they say, well, no, because I don't care what evidence they show me. There's no way on earth that the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC wouldn't be reporting this. You know, because to accept that it was a cabal in the U.S. government that did this, it means to accept that the entire belief system you have about your society is wrong. Mm-hmm. But having experienced what I did at Forbes with censorship and what I knew about the Japanese corruption stuff, so, you know, I started to do the research. Mm-hmm. Find out what's been going on here. And the answer is essentially that European society is not really democratic anymore. It's a plutocracy combined with an aristocracy, and the democracy is kind of a way of keeping tabs on the sheep sentiment, you know, keeping them, giving them a way to vent their frustrations within very restricted boundaries. This is, so, you know, there's many different words out there that people use, and it makes it very hard. A lot of people have trouble even now believing this stuff. So what I'm able to do is I can show you within the normal matrix of financial reports, Wall Street Journal stuff, how to trace it, okay? And what you need to do, and what I did finally to figure this out, is you go back to 1918 edition of Forbes, their first rich list. And you find that the top 10 richest Americans controlled 70% of the money in the country. Mm-hmm. John Rockefeller, the first, was worth about $30 billion in today's money. And I think he controlled 25% of all the wealth in the U.S. at the time. And what happened was, the reason why the Rockefellers do not appear as so rich in the Forbes list, and remember, one of my jobs was to identify billionaires and count their money, was because it's put in as a charitable foundation. And in fact, they have hundreds of them. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Brookings, Hudson's, it's a whole alphabet soup of them. But each generation of the Rockefeller families and the other families, the Morgans, which are the Bush, people and stuff, you can see that they inherit the power. They still control that money. And they have a system so that each generation has one person in charge. So it's like a kind of hidden aristocracy. Instead of inheriting land, they inherit assets. Mm-hmm. And everybody who works within those assets is like a peasant working on the Lord's estate. So if you work for Standard Oil, you're a Rockefeller serf in a way, because they have the ultimate control.
Okay, that's the Rockefeller side of things. Are you also able to trace it from the Rothschilds, the European side?
Yeah. Now, the Rothschild thing goes back 300 years, basically. I think this is well-known stuff, but I can summarize it for you. There was the first Rothschild to appear set up in Frankfurt with a red shield. He changed his name, Red Shield, right? Rothschild. And the local king was going to get involved in a war. And Rothschild said, hey, I'll lend you a bunch of money. And if you win, if you lose, you don't have to pay me back. If you win, I'd like to be your banker. And of course, when he had all this extra money, he could hire lots of more extra soldiers, and he won. And here we have the beginning of a link between royalty and finance. Kings like wars. Wars cost money. And a process of intermarriage between these financial and aristocratic families began. That is, you know, well, it's been going on for 300 years. But the next big thing is we go to, he had 5 sons. And they're set to different parts of Europe. And they had, you know, they were only bankers to kings. They tried to, you know, at the very highest level. And Nathan Rothschild went to England. He started out buying cloth and selling it. And then he sort of, you know, realizing if I control the dye makers and the cloth makers and put it all together, I can make more profit. And so he was exporting British textiles at first. He got richer and richer. And his big coup came in the Battle of Waterloo, where the British exchange, everyone was wondering, you know, if the British were going to win or lose, right? And they knew the Rothschilds had very fast information, quicker than anyone else. My assumption is they were involved in insider trading with the king, okay? Because suddenly Rothschild started selling everything. Just sell whatever you got. Sell, sell, sell. And everyone thought, oh my God, the British lost, the British lost. And stuff that was worth 100 would fall down like 2 or 3. And everyone panicked. They said, oh my God, sell what you have a chance. You know, we're all gonna be, you know, Napoleonic slaves anyway. And then when it fell down, he started buying it all up. And the news came, the British won. And it had been 100 rose to 200. And he controlled most of British wealth after that time. And he said, I don't care, you know, so the famous quote, I don't know the exact words, but what fool sits in the crown of England? Whoever controls the money of England controls England, and I control the money of England. However, you know, I think the Rothschilds had a very deep religious convictions and were at heart fairly decent people. The reason I say that is because although they apparently financed and engineered the U.S. Revolution in 1776 with the East India Company money, they also financed and engineered the Meiji reforms. But these are good things, you know, in many ways. Canada was always been Rothschild territory, and Canada's a very nice country. You know, so I don't think they're the same level. I mean, they did a lot. They had, their system was basically, you know, ancient Babylonian royalty. And this is where it gets really weird and esoteric, but it goes back 5,771 years. The Rothschilds used to say they're descendants of Nimrod, who conquered the peoples of Babylonia. They were a herding people, a pastoral people. And they conquered the people of Babylonia, or present-day Iraq. And they said, well, isn't there some way we can herd people the way you herd sheep? And they came up with a system. You have to control their food supply, you have to control their information supply, and you have to have means of violence to discipline them. And this was the start of the Bible. The Old Testament was, they took all the different stories people had and put it in one story. And this is the only story people are allowed to have.
So we're at the Rothschilds, right? And okay, and Babylonian, Nimrod, all that. But this is the Illuminati you're talking about, right?
Well, I mean, you know, you can call it Illuminati or you can call it the King's Court. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, there's a lot of problems people have with semantics, right? So, for example, if you talk about Freemasons and Illuminati, a lot of people say, oh, that crazy stuff resorted with, you know, that's associated with reptiles and funky UFO things, right? Mm-hmm. And their minds shut. But if you tell them, no, it's like a plutocracy and aristocracy, then they don't have these associations that have been put in their brains, and they can absorb the information. But again, if we talk about the, so I started looking up how the ancient Sumerian society was managed, and you'll find that it's really quite similar to modern United States. In Japan, they used to call the finance ministry the big warehouse ministry, but in the old days, you would have a whole bunch of people who did not grow their own food anymore, right? You have these surpluses. So they'd store this extra wheat in big warehouses, and it would be the high priests who would control the distribution of the food to the masses. And this is now what we call central bankers. But behind the high priests was a king who had godlike powers. And they created the story that there was a god who could see and know everything. And it was an abstract one. So it existed in parallel with a real guy with a beard on a throne who had godlike powers. So this is a system that still exists. Mm-hmm. And remember, if you control the food supply, right, then you can hire warriors and intellectuals and control society, control their thinking, control their food, and control them through violence if necessary. And that's how it works even now. That's why it's so important to understand that finance is control over your food supply, control over your...
And energy supply.
Energy supply, yes. I mean, but at the bottom of the day, at the end of the day, it's food. Without it, you die.
Okay, and basically you keep people busy by sending them to war.
Well,
right?
Okay, I mean, if we fast forward, I think that now the Rothschilds, as a Canadian, I was always kind of proud of the War of 1812. Thought, hey, this little Canada managed to hold off the United States. But apparently what happened was that in 1812, the American Republic decided not to renew Rothschild's banking license. And the American people took control of their own money. And that's why Rothschild invaded the United States. And that was the real reason for the War of 1812. So that's why you have in your anthem, it will say, "Can you see by the dawn's early?" It's a flag in a fort that survived a British attack. So, a lot of our history was hidden, but for the next century, the Rothschilds plotted and schemed to get back control of the United States money supply and therefore the American people. Now, the reason they wanted to do this, I mean, I do believe they had their ideals, They got the best and the brightest, and they would debate, how to do the greatest good for the greatest number. I think it was quite enlightened and liberal aspects to what they did. I mean, if you just look at how the societies like Holland, Canada, and stuff that were under their control, you can see they're really quite nice places for all sorts of different levels of people. But what happened, I mean, this is how I analyze the situation now, is that to take over control of the United States, they tried many things. I think they engineered the Civil War, but they got Carnegie, Harriman to control the railroads and the steel production. And the way they did it was they would lend them the money. But they would lend it in such a way that eventually they would have to give it the railway to the Rothschilds. That was a very clever scheme. But we have, I think, was it William Avery Rockefeller was a horse thief and a seller of, fake medicine. And this was according to Pulitzer's newspaper, where I think they had a big expose on the father of John Rockefeller I. But John Rockefeller I was into oil, and he would buy the refineries. He would come up to a guy with an oil refinery and offer him cash at a low price, And if the man refused to sell, he caused problems with the workers, or maybe sabotage, or whatever necessary. And the Rothschilds took note of this Rockefeller guy, and they decided they'd help him, and they would allow him to transport his oil at much cheaper rates than all his competitors. So he got the oil monopoly. Mm-hmm. And I think most people know about this now, but in 1913, finally, the Rockefellers, the Harrimans, the Warburgs, this group of families were able to take over the Federal Reserve Board, supposedly on behalf of Rothschild. But I do believe that Rockefeller staged a sort of coup d'etat and said, hey, I control the American army, and I control the American economy, and so I'll cooperate with you, but I'm in charge here. And he took over the United States. So I think it became a Rockefeller fief, not a Rothschild one. They meet and they cooperate.
Right. So to this day, you feel that there's a cooperation?
I think there is some cooperation. I think there's also conflict. You can see this in the, for example, pattern of UN resolutions. For example, the Europeans have consistently voted for Israel to solve its problem with the Palestinians based on something like the 1967 UN agreements, with some modifications. And it's the Americans and the Israelis who always vetoed all sorts of different things. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the pattern of European versus American voting in the UN, you can see the difference between the two sides.
Right. So where does Japan fall in this group?
Okay. Now, in Japan, what happened was, after Admiral Perry came, Lord Rothschild sent a fleet, and they attacked the Satsuma and Choshu clans in the south. And they had the Kenmu Emperor murdered, and they installed a 16-year-old boy by the name of Toranosuke Omura as the Meiji Emperor. And they financed the modernization of Japan. So they set up the royal family, the emperor in power, and they helped him modernize Japan. And they fought the Russians. And I think the Japanese were very grateful. And in 1903, after the victory, the Japanese emperors were made part of British royalty. They're given, and every emperor goes to Oxford to study. But I think that after World War II, the Japanese started to get disillusioned because they were not treated as equals. They were not given what they felt a fair deal. They felt there was racism. And this was the essential reason why the British Empire never became a real world empire, was because they would take some very intelligent Indian gentleman, educate him at Oxford, and give him the highest levels of knowledge. But at the end of the day, they'd say, well, you're a wog, you're a bloody wog, so you're just going to have to work for us. If they had made it possible for someone like Gandhi to be the head of the entire British Empire, in other words, let them in, let them join the upper ranks, they would still be in control of the planet to this day. But because they were saying, essentially, at the very top, it's a white man's club, and you guys are just high-level servants, well, they alienated them.
Okay, but how does this relate to World War II and the whole, the Americans eventually, if you're saying Rockefeller helped the Japanese up to a point.
No, I'm saying Rothschild helped the Japanese.
Okay, Rothschild.
But in the 1930s, the Japanese made a break for independence. They wanted to set up the Southeast Asia co-prosperity sphere. They wanted to modernize all the yellow countries so that they could stop colonization by the whites. That's how they looked at it. Unfortunately, the Japanese are an island people, and they're not very good at relations. But what you also have to realize is that history is written by the winners. And so the reason the Japanese were able to take over most of China and were only stopped by U.S. invasion was because a lot of the Chinese actually welcomed them. This is something that you don't read in your history books. But there was an attempt by the Asians to prevent being colonized. They look at the Europeans as like the Borg in Star Trek. Only one way of thinking is correct. If you imagine this giant pyramid of a society with its eye at the top, and you will be assimilated, resistance is futile. I mean, that's how they look at us. And there's something to it. There's a sense that if it's not done the Western way, it's wrong. The good example is the pachinko. I mean, they do have gambling, and it does work, but it's not within the Western-style legal framework. It's in a separate framework. The same way with the bureaucrats. They decide the law. And that's a more living, fast-reacting system than, using endless courtroom battles. I mean, Americans are, 4% of the world population, 20-some% of world GDP, but 50% of the world's lawyers and 50% of the world's military expenditures. So, not too much time spent arguing and fighting as far as the Asians are concerned. So you got to remember, they look at things very differently. It takes a long time to understand their perspective.
Okay, but you wrote a book about Rockefeller and how his role.
Okay, what happened was, once I started to understand all this, and I realized that, after World War II ended, control of Japan went from the Rothschilds to the Rockefellers. And at first they said to the Japanese, you just go ahead and develop your economy any way you want, rebuild your economy, and as long as you're militarily allied to the U.S., that's all we care about, right? Until the 1980s, when Japan had these huge trade surpluses, and this made them very, very nervous. And I now realize why. It's because they had won World War III without fighting, without firing a single shot, because they had managed to control most of the world's financial assets. And money is power. If you have that money, you can hire the soldiers, you can hire the intellectuals, you can...
So how are you saying Japan did this?
By working hard and generating trade surpluses.
Okay,
so the
electronics? Electronics,
cars, nice products that people want to buy.
Right.
And, they were, they had the control of the money, and this is where they started to get worried, and they set out to kind of put the Japanese back in their place. And they managed to get them with this bubble, which was, basically on U.S. orders. They said, first of all, they said, okay, we want you to raise your yen, right? Because they were trying to, they didn't want the Japanese to have control of the money. So they said to them at first, okay, and the yen went from 360 to the dollar to at one point 79 to the dollar. But all that happened was the Japanese moved their industrial base to China and Southeast Asia and got them rich, right? Mm-hmm. So that didn't work. So finally, what they were doing was they were bullying and killing Japanese politicians.
Who was?
The Rockefellers, I would say, at the end of the day. In order to make sure they never were presumptuous enough to use their money the way they wanted to, but rather just hand it to the Americans. And I still haven't checked this out, but I'm pretty sure if you add up all the Japanese trade surpluses and the numbers, and then compare it to what's now officially recognized as Japanese assets, you'll find that the trade surplus is much bigger. In other words, it's like you go to a bar and you say, put it on my tab, and then after a few years you say, well, look, forget about half my tab. Just forget about it. And so the idea is that we'll keep taking money from you forever. It's like tribute payments to the Roman Empire. They send cars, and they send TVs, and they get nothing back except paper. This is how they look at it. And it's right. For 40 years, the Americans have been getting stuff from all over the world and not paying for it.
Why have the Japanese then tolerated that for so long, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, after World War II, they truly and genuinely fell in love with the United States. You know, they were told they were going to be tortured and stuff. I remember this guy shivering in fear, you know, after war, when American soldiers coming, and thinking they're going to torture him, what are they going to do? And the guy gives him a Hershey bar, right? And this is symbolic of, I mean, they were really well treated, and up until the fall of the Soviet Union, they also really felt that they needed the Americans to protect them. And they have created this illusion of fear, right? If you don't have us, you're going to be conquered. But the other thing is that they've been subjected to very intense propaganda since the end of World War II. There was a Dr. Funai, well-known guy here in Japan, who had a senior American officer stay in his house after World War II. And the officer said to him, "We're going to change your education system so that you don't get any more geniuses." And they did. There was the propaganda the Japanese have been subjected to is that, first of all, they've been given an inferiority complex. Second, they've been told that America is a wonderful country. And third, they've been told that without American protection, they're doomed. And they've been deliberately, their education has been dumbed down so they don't know how to argue. They don't know how to debate. They're being trained not to have opinions.
But isn't this also part of the Oriental mindset that even the emperors kind of push down to the people?
There is something to the traditional Confucian model, right? But the traditional Confucian model, the key is that the people at the top have to be true models of modest behavior. I mean, they have to be very morally upright and treat their country like their family, like their kids, and be nice to them. So that's the philosophy. It's not just one of blind obedience to a tyrant, but rather, ideally, it's like a generous and gentle father figure, which is what they aspire to. So what you see in North Korea is a remnant, when you saw with the Maoist thing, of this traditional sort of kingship system of Asia. But
right, so there's a built-in, respect for power and authority and figures on top, thinking that they're beneficent.
Yes.
But that's a naivete. I mean, at the same time, I mean, your explanation has to be a little bit simplistic in terms of why they would accept this kind of like dumbing down, as you call it, of Japanese society across the board. Like, what was in it for them?
Well, they got, first of all, the way to enslave a person is you beat the hell out of them, and then you be really nice to them. And it's like saying, hey, if you do what I say, I'll be really nice to you, treat you well. But remember, if you don't, that's what those nuclear bombs were about.
Okay.
But also, I mean, the Japanese were able to develop their economy. They were left alone, for a long time. It's only in recent years that it's become kind of, really bad, noxious. Okay, there's an illness at the heart of the American system, and what it boils down to is, if you look at financial flows, okay, money has been going from the poor countries to the rich countries, and within the rich countries, it's been going from the poor to the rich. It's like a giant sponge sucking up all human life energy. And the poorest people on the planet, they're forced by agribusiness and other things to the lowest level. And the only thing they can do is hit on something even lower, the poor little weak creatures. They have to burn down forests to make new farmland because they've used up their farmland and they don't get access to fertilizer. So they have to, ravage the planet. So the source of poverty and environmental problems in the world is the people who own the Federal Reserve Board and their policies of prioritizing the rich and everything to the rich. And that is the essence of the problem. And the Japanese have had their savings stolen from them, and they've been forced to adopt economic policies that have increased poverty here. The so-called reforms that Prime Minister Koizumi and Heizo Takanaka were forced by the Americans through blackmail to impose on the Japanese have meant that a recent survey by the Asahi newspaper shows that the amount of people who think their lives have gotten worse since these reforms began is more than double the amount of people who think it got better. They have created a society split between the very rich and the poor. American society is also the same. Mm-hmm. American male workers' salaries peaked in 1973, and they've been falling ever since. So if you look at the medium, the gross mean product, in other words, the level at which half the people are below and half the people are above, you find it's very close to the poverty line. They've been taking money. It's really just too much money has been going to the rich, and they haven't had proper ways to spend it. And they've been deluded into thinking that the problem with the environment is too many brown people burning down forests, and so the answer is to get rid of them. And they have been manufacturing diseases. There's solid evidence that AIDS, HIV, was made by the U.S. military. There's a bioweapon against Africans. Mm-hmm. And
what about SARS?
SARS is a bioweapon that targets a specific gene that is very prevalent among Asians but almost never found among Caucasians. So it's a race-specific bioweapon. Mm-hmm. And
so let's get down to this whole association you had with the Yakuza on one hand, Chinese secret society.
All right, yeah, all right. So this is, as I started to understand how things really worked, and my understanding of news events became very different, because I could merge the two, the conspiracy world and the Wall Street Journal world, right, into one.
Right.
I got an opportunity to interview Heizo Takanaka last year, the spring, and I confronted him with a lot of evidence. In 2003, in February, I believe, he told Newsweek magazine that no bank was too big to fail. And he imposed some arcane economic rules that forced the companies to sell their cross-shareholdings. In other words, the banks and the companies used to own each other's shares, so no outsider could come in and make a hostile takeover. And he forced the companies to sell their bank shares. And he put out that no bank was too big to fail, and everyone thought that meant that the bank shares would be worth nothing. It's like I say, I'll sell you my wallet. There's no money in it, but there's bills. And if you buy it, you have to pay the bills. Well, nobody's going to buy it except you tell your friends, hey, listen, I'm going to put 2.3 trillion yen of taxpayer money in that wallet later, so it's a bargain, right? So what happened was the stock price of the banks plummeted in 2003. And if you look at who bought it, you'll find that it's bought by foreigners. State Street and Banking, Chase Manhattan, Citibank. In other words, a group of financial institutions that are controlled by these charitable foundations that are in controlled either by the Rothschilds or the Rockefellers. Mainly these families. I use Rockefeller as a abbreviation for this group of inbred aristocratic families, the American side versus the European side.
Right.
But, I mean, the Bushes are part of it, for example. So you can actually see it in the financial data. And what happened was the president of Risona Bank did not want to sell his bank to these foreigners. And they have over a 33% share, which is what gives them controlling interest. And he also sold the postal savings. And it was sort of like a gangster husband saying to his wife, hey, come on, give me more money. He said, I got no more. Hey, what about that postal bank? You've still got that. Give it to me. That's what it boils down to. But anyway, getting back to Risona, the president didn't want to hand over his shares, unlike the other banks. They all meekly complied. And so what happened was, he said, hey, I'm not bankrupt. And so his accountant, the accountant in charge of Risona, died in mysterious circumstances. We still don't know if it was suicide or murder. And suddenly, the accounts showed that they were bankrupt. And at the time, ruling party politicians were saying if you got even $100,000, $200,000, buy Risona shares. It's going to be a big deal. And then there was a professor at Waseda University by the name of Uexa who was starting to say, hey, you know, something very fishy going on about Risona. And he was arrested in Yokohama for looking at a girl's underwear with a mirror. No, the woman in question never actually filed a complaint, but never mind. He was fired from his job, taken off his TV shows. I was also blacklisted around that time. I was taken off a lot of TV shows. They said, you're on a blacklist, Mr. Fulford. We can't put you on the show anymore.
Why?
Because you know, like him and like other guys were pointing out the BS about these so-called economic reforms, and they didn't want people to know what was really going on. But anyway, Mr. Ota from the tax department also started investigating Risona for tax evasion and stuff, and he was arrested in Yokohama for looking at girls' underwear with a mirror. And then Mr. Suzuki from the Asahi newspaper, who had a big scoop years ago with the recruit scandal, put out on December 17th, year before last, an article saying that Risona was giving 10 times more donations to the ruling party than other banks, and that there was a suspicion of insider trading. It was supposed to be part of an investigative series. That night, they found his body in Yokohama Bay. Okay? So I confronted Mr. Takanaka with all this information. I have it on video. I have not released the video because Mr. Takanaka has telling me that he was forced to do it because the United States threatened to hit Japan with HAARP, H-A-A-R-P, if they didn't. Okay?
Okay, and what would have been the impact of that? I mean, tell us what that meant to Japan.
Earthquakes.
Okay.
We'll get into that more because I know that this starts getting into really esoteric stuff. It's almost mind-boggling, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I had a lot of trouble wrapping my mind around this stuff for a long time. After I interviewed Takanaka, I got an email from someone at the Japan Development Bank, who's a disciple of Mr. Takanaka's. And he said to me, there's someone, Mr. Takanaka would like you to meet. And I have the copies of the original emails, too. And so I go to a Shinjuku hotel room, and I meet a man wearing a fancy silk kimono. Okay, I have a photograph of him, and I have a tape recording of this conversation. Okay? And he had two rings. One was a mask of a devil with horns, and the other looked like a wedding ring. And you go like this, and there is a Freemason mark. And he says these horns, you could put a little bit of poison on them, touch me, and I'd be dead. And he tells me he's a ninja, which is a professional assassin. And and the guy looks very different from the average Japanese. He's a member of the Sanka mountain people. They're like the Ainu. They're sort of like maybe the Japanese equivalent of an Apache. Mm. Very warlike. They're used by Japanese special forces. Mm. And he says to me, Mr. Fulford, if you want to be, a muckraking journalist, go ahead and do so. But you will die at age 46. However, and he gives me a big Freemason badge. It says, if you don't, the other choice is you can become finance minister of Japan. Okay? So he's offering me a choice between death and the job of finance minister. And again, I have this on tape. I have the email trail. I have the video of my interview with Takanaka. Okay? So it's weird stuff, but I have the proof. Anyway, I thought that I would have no choice but to go along. But I had been reading about, population reduction plans. And so I asked him, is it true? And I have this on tape too. He says, yes, we have to, in order to protect the environment, we need to reduce the world population to 2 billion. And war just doesn't do it, so we're going to try to use disease and starvation.
Who told you this?
The self-described ninja sent by Takanaka. Right? And, I'd already found out that SARS was a bioweapon targeted at Asians. So this is very disturbing. So they're talking about killing 4 billion people. right? So they're offering me the job of, and he said to me, look, we're gonna, we're taking money from the Japanese, but we're not, you know, cutting out their flesh or their bones, We're just skimming off the fat, right? But that's how he described it. So, we're looting these people's money, but we're not going to kill them, And he said the population of Japan would be reduced to 70 million. But they would allow 70 million to live. And they need about 500 million Asians to keep making toys and stuff. So he's describing, massive genocide. Okay? Again, I have it on tape. I can prove this man was sent to me by Takanaka. So the very next day, okay, again.
Well, what did you say to this guy? I'm just curious. I mean, did you say yes, or at that point, or did you say let me think about it, and he said okay, or?
Yeah, I just thought, well, it was all too, overwhelming. I didn't give any clear answer, but I thought maybe I have no choice but to go along with these guys and try to do something from the inside to stop them, right? Mm-hmm. But I guess a lot of people at the very elite, I'm sure it happens to Mr. Obama and Clinton and anybody else at the high level of U.S. politics, that they're someday, or senators, whatever, they're given the same kind of ultimatum. Death or cooperation. So either you join us or you die. And that's how they managed to control the United States and enslave the American people, by capturing their very top elite, mm-hmm. and forcing them to go along with a combination of bribes and
okay, when you say
threats.
They, who's they?
Well, this is what you'd call the Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderberg. Now the Trilateral Commission comes up, but that's not got any power, because the Trilateral Commission was set up by the Rockefellers because the Bilderberg were too racist to let the Japanese in. So it was made as a forum for the Japanese to have their say. But what happened was, and at first some very high level Japanese joined, okay? You have like prime ministers and stuff in there. But the Japanese say, well, hey, they didn't listen to us. I've talked to many members of the Trilateral Commission, right? So now you have, as the head of the Japanese side, as the president of Fuji, Xerox, which is, before they had people like Prime Minister Miyazawa, right? So it's a big drop. It's like, the Japanese say, to hell with your Trilateral Commission, essentially, because you don't even listen to us. It's a not. So anyway, what I'm saying is, it's the families that own the Federal Reserve Board and all their hired hands. They have the money.
So Takanaka's guy, okay, that comes to you, makes this offer to be a Freemason, is sent by who at the top?
Well, Takanaka was a disciple of Henry Kissinger's. And Henry Kissinger worked for David Rockefeller. And I had accused Takanaka of selling the Japanese financial system to Rockefeller. Mm-hmm. Okay, so basically, if you're like, imagine a video game, right? A pyramid, right? And the first step in the pyramid is Boy Scouts, right? Mm-hmm. And about the fourth step is Rotary Club. And you keep rising up. Well, I was getting right to the top level, because they told me, when they offered me to join the Freemasons, they said, look, above the 33rd level, there's 13 levels. Okay? And remember the US dollar bill, the pyramid on top. The I, that represents the people who set the human race to the job of pyramid building. So you see it's an unfinished pyramid. Okay? So above the 33rd step, there's 13 steps. This is the inner group of about 10,000 people who control the West. And I would say a lot of them are very decent people who really wish to do good things and did not wish to find themselves within those ranks but had no choice. So I'd be willing to say that the majority of the people in that elite group are good people with good hearts who want to do good things for the planet, and find themselves in this hidden king's court.
So so you got this offer.
All right.
What did you do next?
Well, what happened was, the very next day, I got a call from a movie director, a Japanese movie director. And he says to me, I want to talk to you about something. So I met him, and he said, there's someone I want you to meet. So I went to another hotel room, right? They seem to like hotel rooms, Went when they want us to talk about important stuff. And again, I recorded this, so I'll never release this recording. The guy tells me that he represents a Asian secret society and that they have 6 million members, including 1.8 million gangsters and 100,000 professional assassins. Now, as I recall, I did tell you I had a degree in Asian studies with a China area specialty. So I had read about this society in the history books. I knew about them. It's the red and the green. What happened was, when the Ming Emperor was like the Ming Empire was like the high point of Chinese civilization. You'll find that the Ming ceramics, the Ming art, everything is at like the highest level. It was really an idyllic society, and they look back at it with a lot of fondness. And there was a general guarding the northern border against the Manchus, and he was very much in love with his wife. And they kidnapped his wife. They said, "If you want your wife back, you're going to have to let us through the gates." And he did. And the Ming Emperor fell. The Ming Empire fell. And the Ming Army became an underground organization, and the Ming Navy. Okay, so the red and the blue are the Army and the Navy. And the blue also is the bureaucracy. So the 1.8 million are gangsters. The other 4.2 million are intellectuals, PhDs, like the really smartest people. And their plan was to overthrow the Qing, the Manchus, and restore the Ming. Now, they were responsible for the Boxer Rebellion, which was against the use of opium, among other things. And this is very interesting because the people selling the opium were Skull and Bones. So they've been fighting this Western secret society since the 1800s, at least.
Okay, but wasn't it the British that introduced opium?
Well, it's the British too, but I mean, if you look at the Skull and Bones, you'll find there were slave traders and opium runners, the so-called China trade.
Okay.
So it was both.
Okay. So you're in this hotel room, and now you understand the background between what he's asking you and saying
Well, they're saying they'd like to offer their assistance to me. Because I'd written in a book about SARS being a bioweapon, and these people are trying to kill you, and you got to do something about it, right?
Okay.
At first, I mean, this is all happening in 1 week, right? This is totally, out of the normal parameter type of stuff that's going on. So it took me a while to digest. It's, the first thing I thought was, well, geez, you could play like 911 videos in Chinatown or something. But I said, look, let me get back to you. Let me think about this. And I spent about a month thinking about it. And I had this great, what I call my Kill Bill moment. There's a scene in the movie Kill Bill, these two women fighting with swords. It looks like it's going to be a long, nasty fight.
Right.
It's not going to be sure who's the winner, right?
Yes.
But one of the women, the bad one, has a one eye missing. She has a patch. And suddenly, she grabs the eye and blinds her and ends the fight.
Unbelievable, yeah. Very, very graphic.
Very graphic, but I thought, hey, why not just target the eye of the pyramid? Because most Westerners don't even know it exists. They're so scared at the top. They kill so many people so frequently that they're terrified, and it's very secret. It has been until the internet came about. Nobody knew about this. I certainly wouldn't have believed it if I didn't run into it firsthand. But then I found the evidence trail. Again, you follow these foundations and who controls them. You'll see that the Rockefellers control about $10 trillion worth of stuff. But anyway, I realized the society has 6 million members. And the Western secret society at the top is only 10,000. So it's 6 million against 10,000. So suddenly I said, well, that's it. Isn't it? We got these bastards. And that's when I started writing the stuff on rents and making. So,
okay, so you must have gone back to this group, which, what do you call this group now? Because they're a group of Yakuza and Chinese secret society. Do they have a name?
The red and the blue.
The red and the blue.
Societies.
And you must have joined them because you're not dead.
Yeah,
And
well, I went to meet all their big bosses
in
and-
China or
in Taiwan,
oh, yeah.
and I joined. I became the first Westerner in 500 years to join.
And then Rockefeller, or I don't know if you want to say Rockefeller, but whoever the Freemasons, the head of the Freemasons, had to leave you alone at that point?
Well, I mean, what the Chinese or the Asians said is, look, we won't make the first move. But what happened was I started writing stuff about Takanaka and Rockefeller. And I got death threats from this ninja, you know. He's saying, you know, Ultraman, you're running out of time, your red light's beaming. You know, it's people who think they're not going to die are the ones who end up in Yokohama Bay. You know, I have the emails, I have copies of these death threats. So
Did you have a bodyguard at that point? Did you hire someone?
No. Look,
No?
if you need a bodyguard, it's too late.
Oh.
You have to operate at a higher level. I mean, if they really want to shoot me, they're going to shoot me. You have to make them not want to shoot you. That's the trick.
Okay, and now, because you joined this group and because the odds, I mean, that made big news when you kind of came out about that.
But what happened was I sent an email saying, hey, look, if you kill me, then every member of the Rockefeller, Rothschild, Schiff, etc. families will die. I mean, there's 600 assassins for every one of them if we want to, right? I mean, we want them killed, they can all be killed, right? But
We understood that to be the majestic, the group, what we call the committee of the majority. They were, in essence, the ones that were threatened. Is this your understanding?
I mean, that was the original idea, but what's happened since then is that I've been trying to get a more accurate picture of what's going on. And I finally narrowed it down to the people who control the Standard Oil monopoly and the people who control the Fed. They are the source of the problem. The oil monopoly, the Americans think that's the key to their geopolitical power, is control over oil. Mm-hmm. But they've lost that control because Putin kicked them out of Russia. They don't control Iran. Maybe they do. I don't know about that. I think Ahmadinejad and Bush may be working for the same team. But anyway, I'm not sure on that one. But Venezuela is also free. Mm-hmm. So they're losing their oil monopoly. And the other thing that's happened is that they no longer have, theoretically, the military ability to take on the rest of the world. Okay, the United States Army cannot defeat China. They've done many different exercises, and every time the Americans lose. The bottom line is the Chinese people are prepared to fight and win a nuclear war. They can put their entire population underground and hit the U.S. with 300 missiles and wipe out every city in the U.S. The Americans can wipe out the surface of China, but it will be underground. So they no longer, and then they can sink their aircraft carriers and shoot down their satellites. So it's no longer possible to militarily beat them.
So
the
what
only
you're
choice
saying,
for the Pentagon, and they know this, is to get soft power. And to do that, they need Japanese money to finance a campaign to end poverty and stop environmental destruction. And that's the proposal I made. I mean, my mission is to come up with a win-win solution for everybody. The best way to prevent yourself from being killed is not to make enemies. And so I don't want to make enemies. I'm trying to make everybody happy.
okay, but you're basically taking what I thought were sort of age-old enemies, which is the Chinese and the Japanese, and they're banding together to fight what is the Rockefellers and the people that own.
Well, when they create biological weapons that kill Asians, well,
they have a common enemy.
yeah, I mean, look, when they're trying to kill us, what are we going to do? They unite, and this society, like I say, if we get back to their history, the Meiji Emperor helped them overthrow the Qing and install the Sun Yat-sen as the president of China, the Republic of China. And so they together helped liberate China. And during the World War II, this society in Japan and other Asian countries all worked in concert. So it goes all across Asia. And the Chairman Mao was financed by the Soviets, who were a Rothschild subsidiary. And so the Green and the Red Gang, they last appeared in the history books in 1949 fighting the communists in Shanghai. And then they disappeared. They went underground again. But in 1967, they kicked out the Illuminati from China. That's why you had the big Soviet-China split, why the Soviet Union and China nearly went to nuclear war. And the Chinese had secretly prepared. They built these huge underground cities to prepare for a nuclear war. They had their nuclear weapons, and that's when they kicked them out. And China became independent again from these Western, central banking families.
Okay, so where does HARP fit in? Tell us about that.
Okay. When I published some essays on the internet about Rockefeller and the Illuminati, the secret history of the Illuminati, I got a call from this ninja guy. He says, "Oh boy, you've now done it. Now there's going to be an earthquake in Niigata. The Americans are going to use their earthquake machine." And boom, the next day, 2 identical 6.8 earthquakes on Japan's biggest nuclear reactor.
Right.
Happened. And this is what Takenaka had told me. He says, the reason I had to hand over the financial system was because they threatened us with their earthquake machine. Imagine that, an ally that's been financing your army, you hit their nuclear reactor with an earthquake machine? I mean, what sort of way is that to treat a friend?
So, okay, well, let's get down to it. So, if that's what they have, then how are these secret societies claiming to fight
Well, you cannot
a machine like that?
You
Because you're talking about scalar weaponry, and I'm sure you know that.
You cannot stop an earthquake. You cannot stop an assassination with an earthquake machine. Western people don't know about their leaders, the true leaders. So all you got to do is assassinate them all. You cannot prevent that with an earthquake machine. That's the point of targeting the eye. But more to the point is you make them a more generous offers. So what I'm saying to the people in the Pentagon is that you have the job of saving the planet and you get even more money than now. I mean, think about it. They spent $600 billion, to steal oil from Iraqis and pipeline rights from Afghanis. With $600 billion, they could have a man on Mars. They could have a base on Mars by now. So we'll give them even more money than they're getting from these idiots who control the oil.
But if they print money, why do they need money?
Well, here's the trick, okay? And this is why it's falling apart this year. Is that since World War II, they've basically said to countries, okay, here's the oil you're allowed to have, and here's your dollars, right? And the backing of the dollar was control over oil and control over a huge military machine, a threat of violence. And there's $53 trillion in circulation, and again, the U.S. government owes $66 trillion to its own people. So, but the United States needs to borrow something like $1 trillion a year now, just to keep going. And they've been doing it for 40 years. So they're basically bankrupt. When if you earn $13,000 a year and you have $120,000 in debt, and they say, well, it's time to pay back. Well, what can you do? Can they threaten violence? No. Because what I just, if it really came to it, the Americans would lose. So they can no longer use their threat of violence. And they've lost their oil monopoly. So that's it. Right? So if you're in the Pentagon, you're thinking, well, geez, the only thing we can do now to save the day is to get all the non-Asian peoples on our side. And the way you do that is you be nice. You fight poverty and save the environment. Help to save the planet. That's so I'm offering them a way out. What would happen is you replace the dollar with a new currency. And it may be necessary to have some kind of global currency, but not as these guys have been planning, controlled in secret by a secret elite. It has to be controlled by the people. Remember that. The key to democracy is control over money by the people, not by a secret elite. It's the money that counts. If you lose control over your money, hand it over to people you can't see, you're a slave. That's what you have to remember. Never, ever again let some secret power elite take control of your money away from you. That's the key. It's people work for money.
But this message to the powers that be was presumably heard when it was published by Henry Macau and by your interviews on Rents last July. And those same people will be watching this, there's no doubt about it whatsoever. And what indicators have you had that that message has been heard, action is being taken, changes are being made?
Well,
what are the pros and cons of this in terms of measuring progress? Because a lot of people want to know the answer to that.
Well, look in the papers. You see, for example, the reports in the New York Times from Davos. You see George Soros saying that the dollar will cease to be the key currency. You have stories in the New York Times again saying that the Pentagon has changed their basic doctrine to country building, right? You have Prime Minister Brown running around saying we got to put India and Brazil and some African countries into the UN Security Council as permanent members. You know, and then you see the U.S. market like in a kind of short circuit, right? Because something's happened, you know?
Right, but you also see Japan, I mean, watching the news daily here, and basically Japan is sort of on shaky ground as a result of the U.S. dollar getting on shaky ground. How does that link up?
Okay, now, this is a false story that's been around, that without the American market, everybody's in trouble. But, you know, it's like a customer who comes to your bar and eats and drinks and never pays. You know, well, you're not going to miss him. You just have to sell to somebody else who actually pay you for it, you know. So
you're saying Japan is not really going on shaky ground, that somehow they're, well, what is the purpose of, this is disinformation,
okay,
basically.
here's the tricky part. The Japanese want to maintain their alliance with the United States, okay? So the idea is to remove these gangsters from the top of the American political structure who control everybody with money, save the Americans, maintain the alliance, and then reorient the Pentagon to ending poverty and exploring the universe. Give them more money than before. And the American economy, you write off their debt, and you give them new financing so they go and rebuild their bridges, rebuild their infrastructure, you know, build new schools, you know, all the stuff that's been neglected because they've been spending so much money on trying to maintain the ability to physically, you know, intimidate everyone else.
Now, you mentioned, I believe, on the update to Rents, that you were being offered the job of finance minister if the Democrats, I believe you said the Democrats come to power here in Japan.
I did not say I've been offered the job. I was offered the job before on the condition that I participate in genocide. What's happening now is that the opinion polls show that the Democratic Party is going to win.
Okay.
And if they do, there will be some big changes in Japan. They will maintain the alliance, but not as a colonial state, but as an equal partner. And, you know, I know their leaders. I've met them. I've been working with them for a long time. And if they give me the job, I mean, then, and only then, would I be able to do this, okay? So it's up to them. But you know, they know my plan, which is to use the Pentagon to end poverty, and it's a good plan. And it would strengthen the U.S. alliance, and it'd be the only way to counterbalance the Chinese, is by, I mean, what are the Chinese doing with their money? They're going to Africa, and they're building roads and hospitals and schools. They're doing it in South America, they're doing it in Bangladesh, they're doing it all over the world.
And they're creating markets for themselves.
They're creating markets, they're making people rich, and they're making friends. And they're not trying to say, you must be like us. You know, there are many different ways to run an economy. You cannot just force everybody to follow your rules. For example, if you have a big man in Africa, and all the money goes through him and he decides how it's distributed, well, that's their system. You give it to the big man, but you just make sure that he doesn't send it all to Switzerland, that it actually goes to his people. You know, the same way with the, for example, the Japanese have this system called dango, which they, you know, some people call it bid rigging, right? But it works both ways. It's a system where the construction companies get together and decide who's going to get the job. And the bureaucrats set the price. Now, if it's abused, right, it can be force the price up too much. But when things go down, it means they can share the pain too. So it's not necessarily an evil system, it's how it's managed. The point is that there are many ways to run finance. It's a question of obligations. I mean, potlatch was a system of finance. You know about potlatch?
No.
The Indians on the west coast of Canada they'd have a party, and at the party the guy would give away everything he owned during the party. And then, you know, he would start going to other parties and start building up stuff. And the guy who gave away the most had like the highest status, right? So it was a way of maintaining financial equality.
Spreading the wealth.
And the people who spread the wealth the most were the most respected. So it was a good system, but it was ruined when foreign traders came in and started parasiting off it, and the Canadian government banned it. But the point is that all of these societies have had financial systems for millennia. You know, it's a way of distributing obligations among people. That's what it is. Why do civilizations have to clash? I mean, why can't they be friends? You know, that's the point. The Chinese don't want to have some ultimate war, and they don't want to conquer you. They just want to be your friends. That's it. It's that simple. Make friends, make love, not war. I mean, you know, that's what.
Okay,
that's what it's all about.
This sounds incredibly wise and very level-headed. Bill, let's have your question, because I thought it was a good one.
Presumably, 6 months after you first delivered this message, as a sort of representative, as a messenger to the powers that be in the Western world, on behalf of the Asian secret societies, they, with their ears to all kinds of intelligence in their own networks, must themselves have given you some feedback about whether they felt that this message had been effectively delivered or not. What have you heard from them since then?
I'll be honest with you, I'm going next week to talk to them. And so it would be better to ask me later. But the only thing that they disapproved of is when I made those threats to kill people. They say, you know, that's very rude and such things are best left unsaid. But what they've told me is that, you know, they'll do what I say as long as I, you know, stick within the original promise, which is a war against poverty and to save the environmental destruction and to put an end to war. Those are the goals. Permanent global peace, no more poverty, no more environmental destruction. That's the bottom line, and if I stick to that, they'll support me.
When you met with Rockefeller,
yeah,
and you interviewed him, and we watched the interview, I mean, it felt to me as though he basically sort of danced and sidestepped and never really directly dealt with anything that you asked him. Now, I don't know what your take was on that interview.
Well, look, I mean, I knew, you see, first of all, that if I had done a hostile interview, I would have got nowhere. Mm-hmm. And so I stuck to the way corporate journalists are trained to talk to people like this, you know, within his parameters.
Right.
But the point there was just to show people that I could have had him killed if I wanted to. Mm-hmm. That, you know, I knew where he was. I could have just called up the guys and say, you know, bring him to a warehouse somewhere. The point is that all those people in the Western elite now know that if they travel anywhere in Asia, or in fact anywhere in the world, if I want to, I can get to them. But that's not what I'm about. I'm not a gangster. I'm not a murderer. I'm not a criminal. So I don't want to have to do that. I really don't.
But do you think that Rockefeller, I mean, did he give you any indication, even after the interview when the cameras were off, that things were changing or things were going to change?
Well, I mean, it's really not in his hands anymore.
Okay.
Because, like I say, the dollar can be destroyed.
Right.
So, and oil is an obsolete energy technology. you can burn water. You separate out the hydrogen and burn it, and this whole nonsense about how you have to put in more energy than you get out, it's just not true. There are many ways to get at least 4 or 5 times more energy out of it than you put in. The Japanese, a senior Japanese politician told me they had this technology for more than 30 years. There's a Nikola Tesla technology that's 100 years old. In other words, they've been holding back human technological progress in order to maintain control over their oil monopoly and, take the people's money. Okay?
Right.
But now that's come to an end. Oil does not have to be used anymore. And the Chinese are now developing these new technologies. They've just started, but you'll see it.
Okay, now we happen to be party to some very great information that appears to be very solid, which says the Americans have had this free energy for 40 years. All right?
Right.
That they are terraforming Mars, that they do have bases on the moon, that China is on, they're in another moon race as we speak right now, but supposedly China is basically trying to follow them in their footsteps. But in other words, the stakes are much higher than oil. Oil's the cover story at this point.
Well, if that is true, then it's really a question of trust. Okay, it's really a question of realizing that it's all one planet, we're all one people, and maybe they're doing that, but I still see ecosystems being destroyed on this planet, and I see a very, very incompetently managed planet Earth. There are so many things they could do. Well, why don't they terraform Earth? For example, they could put huge pumps in the dead parts of the tropical oceans and pump the nutrients up to the surface. And you could increase the amount of fish by 10 times, for example. If you end poverty, then people aren't going to have to, burn down forests. And you end environmental destruction. And you have so many more intelligent humans helping the planet. In other words, they should fix the problems on the planet Earth. It's easy to do. It's just a question of cooperating with all the other peoples. Now, I would suggest, my idea is for a new kind of replacement for the UN Security Council is to have the Earth divided into 7 regions. North and South America, Europe, China, Japan and Southeast Asia, the Muslim countries, India, and Africa. 7 zones. And each have 1 vote on the Security Council. And a veto would only cover their particular zone. So the Chinese can only veto a decision about China. And that would lead to a much more effective decision making, and that would make it possible to deal with things like overfishing, poverty, environmental destruction, all these problems. It's a question of sharing the planet and the rulership of the planet with the people of the planet. So if they really are terraforming Mars and they really do have this technology, then why are we still paying for gasoline at the gas station? That's nonsense. That's very, very criminally wasteful of human resources and human potential.
So, I mean, just, with all due respect, I would suggest that what you need to also do is approach this whole band of secrecy that has covered the globe at the Americans, majorly at the Americans' request or demand, that covers things like free energy, like a secret space program, like, the fact that there may be other races from other planets visiting our globe. And this is something that you don't deal with.
I don't deal with it on purpose because if there are other races, then they're not appearing on our TV sets and they're not getting involved in our politics in a way we can see. So it's a sort of, they're leaving us on our own. So therefore, I think we have to come up with a human solution to the planet's problems. And if then we get contact with other beings, then great. I think they're waiting for us to come up with a coherent and peaceful way of running the planet before they're willing to welcome us into, galactic society, because they don't want to have a warlike, society controlled by a criminal clan heading out into the universe with huge weapons and stuff, right? So if I were them, I'd quarantine us until we came up with a peaceful model for running our own planet.
Okay, so you're talking. I mean, I'd hire you in a second. I'd let you run, be finance minister, because you have such a great in-depth sort of grasp of what is going on economically on the planet, and you also have a great vision for the future. And both those things are really politically amazing, something you never come across even in, especially in U.S. politics, not to mention most politics in other countries. So do you really think that you're going to be successful? I mean, do you have a group that's supporting you? I understand that you have the secret societies, but beyond that, have you set up, a network prior to this?
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of Japanese politicians who support me. A lot of intellectuals support me. The books I write are read by the most intelligent people in Japan. They're not, reading for entertainment. So it's amazing, given the subject matter, how many people do read them. But, they say the pen is mightier than the sword. And I think I've convinced a critical mass. And the last obstacle was this fear. But now the gangsters have also decided that they like what I'm saying. And of course I've told them I'll make sure they prosper more under the new regime than the old, because this is about win-win, right? And
what about the American government? Has any politician from America tried to contact you?
I've been contacted by intelligence peoples, like CIA, Pentagon, and Freemason peoples.
Okay, and have they continued to threaten you, or are they trying to work with you?
They're trying to work with me. I don't think they see me as a threat anymore. I think they understand that's not what I'm about. I'm here for a win-win solution, And
are you at liberty to tell us anybody in particular that you've dealt with?
not at this point.
Okay.
But it's clear that the problem has been the oil monopoly and the military people, not the Pentagon, but the military billionaires, the contractors and stuff. In other words, we need to get rid of the oil
Carlyle
monopoly.
Group.
Yeah, it's really boils down to that. Just get us, quit keeping us addicted to oil.
I understand what you were saying about the ethics of the secret societies. In other words, that they may well intend to take someone out if they misbehave, but it's very impolite to be so brazen about voicing it publicly. These things are presumably meant to be implied and understood without having to be so brazen and uncouth as to actually threaten somebody. This is my take on what you're saying there. But just to fast forward to a worst case scenario, let's say that there are some factions in the Pentagon or behind the scenes that have an interest, for whatever reason, sane or insane, in starting some kind of an attack on Iran that could lead to a nuclear escalation. Would you believe that in that situation, then these societies would actually start to take people out, because this would be unacceptable?
Yeah, no, I mean, that would be certainly a line to be crossed, that shouldn't be crossed. I mean, if they're going to try to kill billions of people, then we're going to have to kill 10,000 people in order to prevent that, if necessary. And the arrangements have been made. It's just a matter of me sending an email or making a phone call, or a matter of someone coming and killing me.
And what about war? I mean, what is your, are you, approaching that, like, are we going to have war with Iran? Are you working with these groups? Are they
the idea
trying
is
to turn that paradigm?
To replace war with a different kind of economic competition. So it would be like a peaceful war, sort of like a global Olympics. For example, the Americans would compete with the Chinese to develop Africa, or, in other words, come up with some sort of way where periodically give everybody on the planet a goal that they all work towards. And that would, because the one thing war has done in the past, it has motivated people to go to extraordinary efforts. Unfortunately, it's been efforts to kill and conquer. But the idea of mobilizing people can be used for peaceful purposes. The good example was Hitler starting up the Autobahns. He says, okay, you're all unemployed, you got no work, all right, we're going to build the best highway system the world has ever seen. And they did. So never mind all the genocide and stuff, that happened later, but just the idea that you mobilize everybody. So for example, I'm saying this, I've been asking for a 3-year campaign at the end of which all environmental destruction will be stopped. Every kid on the planet will have a full mind and a full stomach, and human potential will be released. And the economic benefits would be just totally mind-boggling. At the same time, instead of having something like DARPA, high-tech research for the purposes of killing, make it high-tech researches for the purposes of promoting life. For example, immortality is around the corner. If you could live another 30, 40 years, you could probably live to be 1,000 or more if you wanted. So they should put as much resources as possible into that. And we can make ourselves more intelligent with drugs, with gene therapy. So raise our intelligence. We could have a kind of a paradigm shift, a fractal shift, really like the Cambrian explosion, with a matter of maybe dozens or hundreds of years at the most, if we want. What if everybody raises their IQ to 200, 300, and they got infinite free power and immortality? Who knows what we're going to think up? It'll set off a kind of a exponential explosion of progress, which can only begin to wonder and imagine what it's going to be like. But it's real. It's not some kind of science fiction. It's all there in the current technology. You can read it and see it.
Right.
So it's a question.
We have it within our grasp.
Yes, and so we should really just go for it. Try to save every soul you can. If we can make everybody immortal, we should. And then if there's not enough room for them, we'll have to go into space. And, but...
So in essence, does it seems like this threat, that you're talking about the Yakuza and the secret societies have made to, in essence, the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds, right? The ones that are at the very top, that if things don't change, they are basically going to be motivated to sort of eliminate them.
It's a slave revolt they're dealing with, basically. And it's one they can't stop this time. Kennedy basically led an unsuccessful slave revolt.
Right.
In other words, these people are being like dogs in the manger. They're not trying to keep all the good stuff to themselves. And I think that we can learn about the future by looking at our evolutionary past. So when the billions and trillions of cells that make up our bodies agreed to become part of one body, there was some serious bargaining. So some cells got to be brain cells, and some cells had to be asshole cells, right? But to compensate, for example, the asshole gets lots of pleasure, and they don't have to work very hard, and it's treated with respect. People even lick them. So the point is that the same way, if somebody's got to collect garbage and clean toilets, then you got to give them shorter working hours, better pay, and compensation for that work. In other words, by creating a really good balance for all people, you will maximize human progress. That's the bottom line. It's common sense. You don't suppress people, you lift them up and release their potential.
Have you been contacted by MJ12 or what we know, the Committee of the Majority that you know of?
The contacts I get are like phone calls from different people.
Do you know who Dan Burish is?
No.
Okay. Well, he is part of that group. Or has been in the past, and he actually sends his regards.
Okay.
They're quite aware of you. What I was just wondering is, if you have been consciously, you know, dealing with them on any level.
Well, I mean,
in other words, I know you're getting emails from members of Intel, but this is a group that is basically comprises what we know of as the secret government of the United States and possibly the world. Okay.
Well, I mean, all the contacts I've had have been indirect. I don't think they took me seriously until they realized I could get Mr. Rockefeller or anybody else if I wanted to. But the other thing is that I've been going through, you know, when I was at Forbes, the job I was doing was so cushy and lax that I only need to work about 1 day a week and use 20% of my potential. Now I've been in way over my head for a very long time. I've been forced to expand my potential, you know, to just kind of deal with what I've taken on. And so, you know, my understanding of the situation has evolved, the plans have evolved, but the idea is to bring this from the theoretical to the real.
Right.
And it's, you know, the goal is to have a big change on August 8th. Just make that a kind of a date. Just have a huge party.
The date of the Olympics.
Yeah, I mean, and just have a huge party worldwide, and then promise no more war, and then just, you know, agree that we all work to save the planet. Just all you have to do is focus on what you agree upon, and you'll find that people agree upon far more than they disagree about. Mm-hmm. I remember when I first came to Japan, I was working in an English conversation coffee lounge, and this lady is saying, "How are the Japanese different from Westerners?" And I'd say, "Well, they're different this way and they're different that way," and she said, "Well, how are they the same?" And it's like I got hit by a bolt of lightning. My God, I mean, they're 99.999% the same. Mm-hmm. People everywhere. If you forget about the semantics and the cultural froth, they want the same things. Mm-hmm. They agree, fundamentally. Nobody likes poverty. Nobody likes environmental destruction. Nobody likes war. So we agree on that, then everything else can be discussed over a cup of tea. No need to fight about it.
Okay. You know, I know we kept you for a really long time, but just one or two of our last questions. You're dealing with secret societies, okay? But do these secret societies let you in on their secrets yet?
Well, some, yes. Some, I mean, depends what. I mean, but do I really need to know? I think that one of the secrets I've found out is the Yakuza all work for the Emperor, for example. They're like the FBI and the CIA in this country.
Okay, so how is the Emperor taking your message?
Well, I think he's the guy who's been nudging me along in this path, you know, secretly.
Okay.
I think, you know, I wrote an essay a long time ago saying if I was General MacArthur, what would I do? And I sort of said, well, I'd, you know, invite all the best experts in the world and try to make Japan the best country in every single area possible. When the major reforms, they could only afford second or third level people, but now they could get them, you know, they could hire every Nobel Prize winner who ever lived, who's still alive. I mean, they've got $5 trillion and just make Japan an example for the world. Mm-hmm. And that still could be done, you know. Mm-hmm. I think, for example, cities should be covered with green. Trees and animals and plants should be able to freely roam cities. There's got to be a way to make nature and cities compatible, for example. That's something they could do. I mean, there's a lot of things. There's so much potential. If people are once again allowed to dream about the future and then try to make those dreams come true, it's really it's a question of, right now, phenomenal waste. I mean, the Japanese know more than anybody. They have one resource. That's human brains. And most of the human brains on this planet are being wasted. It's the most valuable resource we have, and it's being wasted and deliberately dumbed down and destroyed.
What about the undersea cables that were recently cut that basically took the internet? You've heard of that,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, as many are saying that it's too convenient that undersea cables would be cut in two different areas exactly simultaneously, taking out
I got a phone
communications.
call from the number 3 man in the Inagawa crime gang saying that they were going to hit Kawasaki with a HARP, on sometime between February 12th and 15th. And I think this is all kind of immature posturing and hollow threats that are really kind of not dignified. And, you know, there's going to be no losers, right? So there should be no reason to try to do this. I mean, these people have been having this plan, right, to eliminate, you know, 4 billion people and then give the rest of the planet a high level standard of living in harmony with nature. But the reason they've had this plan is because they couldn't understand other cultures. And they couldn't impose their own culture on these other cultures. And that's the essence of the problem. If they realize that they have so much to learn and there's so much human potential that's going to be wasted, they'll realize it was a very stupid plan in the first place. And the idea of wanting to enslave humanity is not the way it's supposed to be. They're supposed to lead humanity. And that means behaving in a way that people want them to lead. And that should be easy for them. So, you know, for example, if they want to have all of Israel, then the easiest thing would be to pay $1 million or so to each Palestinian. You know, and then they can build their temple. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if they finance research on immortality and superpowers, well, I mean, that's going to be like, I think that would fulfill their biblical prophecy. These people who want to, you know, obsessed with creating a sort of Armageddon, right? And I still invite them. I said, look, you know, you've been preparing for this for so long. You've spent so much money on this. Give us a show, you know. Make it a virtual Armageddon. You know, fill our screens, turn on your hologram machines, whatever it is, you know, and you can make it come true without killing billions of people. And you're not going to be able to kill billions of people anyway. Because even in the Pentagon, I think they understand now that these people have been obsessed with a, you know, ancient book, and they've lost touch with reality. You know?
Well, that's a great way to put it. Very simple, very direct, and very true.
You know, and so look at the reality is that you've got a situation where wonderful things are going to happen. More wonderful than they can imagine.
Okay, one last question. Okay. Magic. Okay. You obviously have been trained to some degree in the occult and what goes on behind the scenes. So you've got you know, entities that represent sort of good and evil, for lack of a better way of associating it. And you know that you're dealing with these forces when you're approaching the world in this way. Have you been dealing with this? And do you feel that you sort of have the good on your side at this point?
You know, I don't usually like to talk about this stuff because people will start thinking I'm a weirdo. But if you ask my girlfriends, for example, they'll tell me that at night I'm not there. The only thing that's left is my body. I mean, animal functions. There's no... I leave my body every night.
We all do,
yeah.
in my opinion. But what are you saying with that?
Well, I mean, I've had some very, very unusual experiences. Like I had one experience in particular where it felt like my entire nervous system was almost overloaded with information. It was like, and it was an image of the planet as an egg about to hatch, you know, and, you know, really burst out into billions and trillions of species, and, you know, it's like the Cambrian explosion, but it was so intense. I mean, there's no really good way of describing it, but it's not something that you could have through a vivid dream or a hallucination, because it was like almost total overload. It's like a giant zap of energy, way beyond anything I'd normally possess. But there's a lot of very mysterious stuff being going on. But I try not to mix that in because I'm trying to stay at the lowest common denominator of everybody's understanding. You know, because if you start talking about stuff like this, all sorts of people are going to get turned off and say, oh, he's a weirdo, he's a flake.
Right.
So you know, I try to stick within the matrix, within everybody's paradigms and frameworks in order to make sure they understand the information.
But you know you're working outside the matrix at this point, or you have the potential to.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely, you know, actually I have a problem. I spend so much time outside of the matrix, I have trouble earning a living these days, so I have to get back in and do stuff to pay my bills, you know.
Right, so the bottom line is that you don't have a job actually yet as finance minister, should that come about. So in essence, here you are in this incredibly interesting sort of position.
You know,
but it doesn't pay the bills.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have jobs, I do pay my bills, you know, but I'm now working towards this. We're close. I mean, I think the target date is August 8th. I'll go to Taiwan, I'll talk to society. There's, you know, lots of big things are going to be happening, but, you know, I'm just hoping that the best thing is that everybody would agree that we need a fresh start. Just a clean slate, have a big party, and then just change the way we run the planet. I mean, the post-war system has become dysfunctional. And the idea that a tiny Western minority can rule the planet is obsolete. It's not working. And that's what we have to get these people to understand. And it's not going to be a threat to them. It's going to be a huge benefit to them. It's going to be something they were going to wishing they had done years ago.
Okay.
It's like, why didn't we think of that? Why didn't we do this sooner?
Do you have family members behind you?
Yeah, I know. I have a lot of people behind me. I mean, my family in Canada, I don't have much contact with them, so they don't really, they think probably I've gone off the deep end, you know. But senior politicians in Japan and heads of the Yakuzas and stuff, they know where I'm coming from.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any final message that you'd like to give anyone who happens to be watching this video to see what you're going to say next?
It's just going to be a wonderful, wonderful things are going to happen. That's the idea. Just absolute magic. I mean, everybody's dreams will come true. That's the goal.